Okay, we're down here at the print farm today and doing a little bit of work on our ANET A8 Plus printers. And I'm going to show you what I'm doing to them. These are some modifications that need to be made after they've run so many hours. And today we're changing the bearings. As you can see, these are the plastic bearings that the bed glides on, and we're replacing them with these aluminum cased bearings, which are a lot better. And one reason we're replacing them, if you look closely at this, you'll see that there is a lot of movement in that bearing, a lot of wearing on it. So it's causing this bed to, as you can see how it's moving, it has too much play in it. So replacing those bearings should take care of that and get the play out of this thing and get it tuned a little bit better. So I'm going to do that, and I'll periodically turn the camera on and show you the different steps as I get it on, and we'll see how much we can improve on this wobble here. Okay, we've got the two bearings loose on this side, and we've also had to take this loose at the end, this bushing that holds the end of the rod. Now when we take it up and move it, you'll notice there's a little piece of filament underneath it. That little piece of filament was a spacer, because in addition to having everything tight on the printer, these rods have to be sometimes shimmed a little bit, adjusted, so that we've got good parallel travel with this bed. Otherwise, when you go to level the bed, as it comes forward, if this side's a little too low, it will cause this corner to be high. But then when it goes back, then that corner drops down. That's some adjustment that I've had to do in the past, and I'll have to redo this and re-shim it once I've replaced these bearings. But now that we've got those off, we can pull these two bearings off, like so, and then we can put a new one on there. Clean this rod a little bit too. Now when we put this new bearing on, if you notice, it has very little play. Feels like it's fitting pretty good, so it should give us a tighter fit. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and install these two bearings. Just bring this bed forward, set it down on there, line the holes up. We'll get a few screws in it there. We put these screws in, we're not tightening them down. We're going to get them just barely snug, because we need to make sure that these bearings are lined up on this shaft, that one doesn't have too much stress on it. If it does, it'll cause that bearing to wear out faster. Okay, we've got them kind of snug there. That's good enough. Now we can get the second one, line it up, get the screws in it. A lot of maintenance on these printers. If you're going to run them like I do, and run production jobs on them where it just runs continuously. Some of these ANETs like this will run 2 or 3 weeks without ever being turned off. just continuous, just one run after another. And I don't care what kind of printer you have or how good a printer you have. Parts are going to wear out. And they have to be replaced when they wear out. No question about that. Okay, I already feel that a lot of the wobble's been taken out of this thing. Now we'll reinstall this end. Reinstall our little shim here. Not sure if we're going to need it or not, but since we had to have it before, there's a good possibility we'll need it again. Not tightening that down completely yet either. Okay, now we'll go to the other side over here. Finish wiping that shaft off. We're going to put all new grease on these rods once we get the bearings replaced. There's several things that we've had to do with these A-nets to make them reliable in producing these parts that we make. Not only for ourselves, but for other customers. I think I've mentioned before that we do make some larger parts for some other customers. They take these larger printers. They consume a lot of filament. We've had a lot of storms in the area lately, and some fairly severe. The ones that caused the devastation in Mississippi came through here the other night, and although it wasn't anywhere near as severe as the tornadoes Mississippi had to endure, nevertheless we had a lot of high winds and severe storms that took down a lot of trees on my property here. I'll give you a shot here of some of the trees that I lost, and where I'm having to go out and clean up that mess. Okay, we'll get some new bearings on this one. Anyway, like I was saying, the storms came through, took out a lot of trees, took out power lines. We were without power here for over 24 hours. And today we had more storms coming through and high winds. And those high winds were causing several power blips where the power would go off for about 30 seconds or a minute and then come back on. Usually that indicates that branches or trees have fallen, hit power lines, caused them to swing into each other and temporarily trip a breaker in the system. They've been able to get them reset fairly quickly. But when conditions are like that, I don't like taking any chances, and so any printing is out of the question. So that's why it's nice and quiet here today, and I'm doing this kind of work. because this is the second day in a row that we haven't been doing any printing. But it's a good time to do maintenance. Okay, we got our 2 new bearings on here. Let's slide this back down. If you can see, we'll just line them up there. Start our screws in. And again, at this point, none of the screws for any of the bearings we've installed on the other side have been tightened down yet. They're just semi-snug. They're still loose enough that the bearing can move a little bit, and that will allow it to realign to the shaft before we tighten them down. And you want to make sure all bearings are lined up before you tighten them down. If you tighten them down, one of them down prematurely, and it's cocked a little bit, and then you tighten the others down and they're lined up perfectly, that one bearing is going to constantly have more friction on it, and it will wear out quicker. And it also keeps your bed from running smooth. You want this bed to run free and smooth. Takes strain off of your belt so that your belt doesn't lose tension and have to be replaced as often. Okay. Now we've got all of our bearings on here, but they aren't tightened down yet. And what we're going to do is put a little bit of grease right there and right there. A little bit here, a little bit here. Now we've got a little bit of grease on those bearings. Check our belt tension. It feels pretty good. Okay. Now we'll go ahead and tighten these ends down. Okay, now it's time to tighten the bearings down. Bring it forward here, and you always tighten, go diagonally. Then you go over here, that one, then come up here and get this one. And go back to your first one, kind of like tightening lugs on a car wheel. Then you go around and you tighten all of them like that. Okay, bearings are all tightened down. Got good travel. Okay, now if you notice, here are the springs I took off. These are the springs that came with this printer for the bed adjustment. And I had added these larger ones on the outside of it to make it stronger. This time we're going to change, and we're going to go to a different spring. We're going to put these stronger medium-sized springs on this time when we put the bed back on. So let's check everything again. If you notice, there's absolutely no wobble in this thing. Changing those bearings took every bit of it out. So these bearings, they have this plastic case, and even though they're fit in there tight, they just don't last very long. Okay, we've got our bed back on, getting ready to put the glass on. We'll go ahead and plug in our connector. These power connectors, I'm still doing more work on those. You can see I've taped this up here to add some more strain relief to it. But we do have a problem with those wires flexing and breaking. Another thing too on this bed, when we put these retaining clips on here to hold this glass on the bed, I put 8 retaining clips, 2 on each side, 2 on the front and 2 on the back. And the reason I do that is because when you're printing large parts on this printer and you get up to a fairly high point in the print, let's say you're up here around 100 millimeters, then every time that head moves across that part, there's some contact. Because as you lay down the beads, especially when you're printing like I am with 0.8 millimeter nozzles, those 0.8 millimeter nozzles will cause that filament, instead of just laying down a real small bead, you've got a pretty good sized bead, and sometimes it doesn't lay down flat. Sometimes it's a little higher behind the nozzle. It comes up behind it since you're extruding so much filament and at a high temperature. And what that does, when the head comes back to cross it, it can actually come in contact. And there's some friction there, and you'll feel it's like dragging something across a rough surface. And if this bed isn't fastened down, this glass isn't fastened down good, you can have extremely good adhesion, but I had the glass move on me and shift the part. So, you know, like I say, I try to learn from all of my experiences. So I learned that if you put 8 clips on this thing, that it will be strong enough that the glass won't move. So that's why I put those 8 different clips on it to hold it down. So now we've got our new bed and no wobble in it at all, no movement at all. So this printer is going to print a lot better, a lot higher quality print than before. Because before, what would happen, the outer surfaces, because of that slight movement, would be a little bit rougher and not as smooth as they could be. So this will really smooth up the whole print and give me a lot more accuracy. It's mainly going to be cosmetic, because even with the wobble that I had before, it was still making a functional part. Our goal is to make a functional part, but also make it look as good as we can. Another thing on this printer, if you'll notice, we've got our brass nozzles here, and then we've got hardened steel nozzles here. Okay, the ones that we're using on this printer are these 0.8 millimeter hardened steel nozzles. The reason is because we're extruding so much filament through them, and because they do come in contact with the part and so forth, they'll just last longer. However, I've found out one thing about these hardened steel nozzles, especially in the ANET A8 printers. On the ANET ET4s, if you notice, you have two screws here that hold the heat block to the heat sink, and then you have a tube connecting the two, so everything's tightened down pretty secure. On the ANET A8 Plus, this is what the hot end looks like. You don't have the screws connecting the hot end. So this tube, this threaded tube, actually has to be locked in place by the nozzle. Okay, the problem I had was with the brass nozzles like this, no problem. But when I started using these hardened steel nozzles, I found out that you tighten them down and put everything back together and you start printing, and after so many hours of printing, this nozzle, because of the heat expanding and contracting when it cools off, causes it to loosen up. And it will actually loosen and cause this hot end to come loose. When it does, then it starts extruding small amounts of filament, molten filament, at the top of the heat block, and also where the nozzle screws in, and that will come down and start messing up your printer. Plus this thing starts getting loose and it will move. When this thing moves, it's going to change position, start messing up your print. And I actually had one the other day that came loose, and the nozzle actually came off. And here's the cover that went over, the silicone cover that went over it. So it started extruding metal all around the place, and then finally the nozzle came out, and then it just started extruding, and this is some of the filament that came through. It just came straight through without any nozzle until I was able to get down here and shut the printer off. So my practice now is whenever I use these hardened steel nozzles, I retighten them about once a week, depending on how much I'm running the printer. Sometimes more than that, but you have to have it up to your full operating temperature. Mine's about 225 to 230 on the head, and get it up to that temperature, and then put a wrench on that heat block and tighten that nozzle down really tight. So if you're using hardened steel nozzles, my advice is make sure they're tight and check them periodically, because they have a tendency to work themselves loose just by the heating and cooling process, expansion and contraction of that metal. Obviously it's different than brass nozzles, so it's probably doing a little more expansion and contraction. I'm not a chemist or an engineer in thermodynamics, but it's definitely been a problem for me, and since I started tightening them more often, periodically checking them, I haven't had any more problems. Okay, we've got our ANET A8 back together here. New bearings underneath. We put new springs on. Got everything leveled, set up, checked our belts and tension, lubricated everything good. Put a new 0.8 nozzle in, hardened steel. Everything looks like it's working good. Had to recalibrate our Z-axis motors on each side. We were a little bit downhill on this side over here, And of course the way we do that is using a caliper. Get that measurement and make sure that they're exactly the same on both sides, and then we double check our bed against the rods to make sure that we're level there. Then we level up the bed and everything leveled out good. We're starting this print. This is one of the large parts that we print. It will take 300 meters of filament, and it will print for almost 24 hours. But everything looks like the first layer's coming down good. So if the first layer's good, we should be able to complete the print job. And this printer should be good to go for another couple months before we have to do any more major maintenance on it. Okay, we've got a little problem with the excavator. Some type of an electrical problem that's keeping it from operating properly. We were using it to clean up some trees that came down during a recent storm that we had, and went ahead and had a couple of the logs off one of the trees cut up into these little stools. You're probably going to see them in a later video. I'm going to take those and put them around a little campfire, have people sitting on them with the lap diners on, eating their dinner out in the woods, and use that as a little marketing tool for the lap diner. But here's some of the trees that we piled up over here after we were able to cut them up with the chainsaw. And there are several more back there on the other side of that fence that are down. We put some of them over here on this side. We'll have to have a fire for that. But right through here is where most of the damage was, and there are a couple other trees down over there. So just another mess I have to clean up. Seems like there's always something. It took out the fence between here in this area. So I'll have to decide if I want to replace the fence there. Here's some of the old fencing and posts and stuff. And it broke that one tree off about halfway up there. So probably have to use a chainsaw to cut it off. If I try to take it down, it'll probably take the other tree with it, since the roots are so close together. But just a lot of cleanup I have to do here. Thankfully, I've got a lot of helpers here. So until the next time, happy printing from New Tech Inventors.